Peace, peace, peace. We back. For those that's chiming in, welcome to the new podcast, which I call Rational Lens Podcast, where logic comes into focus, and we're building on the two Americas. Because you had two Americas. You had the natural indigenous America that was put together by your indigenous Native Americans, which we know them as the 5 civilized tribes, your Choctaw, your Chickasaw, your Cherokee, and your Seminoles, right? And your Iroquois, which were a confederation of 6 nations, which was the Mohawk, right? The Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. And they had something called the Confederation of the Iroquois, the 6 nations, and they created something called the Constitution of the Great Peace. And that was the first constitution of the United States of America by the indigenous aboriginals who were so-called Native Americans, 5 civilized tribes, way before your black conquistadors. That's right, their black conquistadors came here and took land and resource from their own people. And they came from Europe, and they were part of the black nobility of Europe, who were known as the Moors, right? And when they came over here and they conquered certain regional areas like Mexico and Cuba and Haiti, right? They put those regional areas under their behest, and they enslaved and robbed and steal land and resource from the indigenous people there. And they created what we call the United States Corporation, which was started by George Washington. You understand? There were other presidents that were part of the original founders of America, who were your indigenous people of the land, your aboriginals, who were your Native Americans, who lived under a constitution that they called the Great Law of Peace, which was put together by a 6-nation confederacy that were known as the Iroquois. And then later on, you have these black conquistadors that came over here under Spain and Portugal and England and Germany and the Dutch. You understand? And they started to rob and steal and take land away from your indigenous people. And they came together, especially under the Britain Empire, and they created the corporate United States. And they rewrote the Constitution, which was under the power of George Washington. And they created this new Republic Federacy, or I should say Federation, Republic Federation. And we know the Republic means sovereign, and federal means being under one power. A group of people being under one power, under one controller, which is, we know as the Federal Reserve Bank, right? Because it's the Federal Reserve Bank that runs the United States Corporation, who took over the indigenous United States that was put together by the indigenous people, which were the Native Americans who lived under a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. It was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy. And there's a difference between confederacy and federal. Before I start reading the book, Black Conquistadors, because this book brings home that it wasn't just Europeans, white Europeans, that did the robbing and stealing and enslaving of the Indians, that it also, before the white people was doing it, there also were black conquistadors that came from the black nobility in Europe, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the England, the people from England, Germany, the Dutch, all these Anglo-Saxons who we think is white was originally dark-skinned, and they enslaved and conquered their own people, right? So let me give you a difference between a confederacy and a federation. Because we had a confederacy, right? The indigenous people were to the Native Americans, they lived under a confederacy. Right? Because they were called the Iroquois of Confederacy. And they had the first constitution of the first United States, which was put together by the first original founding fathers before George Washington, who were under the Article of Confederation. They had a Continental Congress, the Article of Confederation, and you had a group of members of black Republicans who were indigenous to the land. You understand? They had their own constitution. It was a confederacy, right? And it says a confederacy, a league or alliance, especially of Confederate states, right? An alliance or, right? It says an alliance or a league, right? In the etymology, the word confederacy comes from the word confedere, joined together. That's Latin. The Old French, confederacy. And then English, confederation, right? Which means joined together in a league. So the confederation means that these Native Americans who were indigenous to the land came together and they lived together in peace because they had the first confederacy was the first constitution was the Great Law of Peace. And they created something called the Article of Confederation, right? Which they had the Continental Congress that they came together and they made decisions. These members of the Confederacy they were Republicans. You understand? Your Native Americans were Republicans. They believed in sovereignty. They didn't believe being enslaved by anybody. And they believed everybody should have their own individual sovereignty. That's why they can live together as a confederacy. You understand? And that's why they created this Article of Confederacy, the Continental Congress, which the first constitution was known as the Great Law of Peace, which was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Oneida, and the Tuscarora. And you also had your 5 tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, your Seminoles, right? Etc. These were all black indigenous tribes who lived together in peace, and they built an advanced civilization here. They had temples, they had buildings. You understand? They already had a social construct society that they were living under in peace and harmony with each other. Before your black conquistadors under the Spaniard, the Christian Spaniards, who were your black nobility, came over here and conquered them and took land and resource and then reformed a whole new America, which is a corporate America, which is under admiralty law, which deals with commerce, trade, and military conquest. And also imprisonment or enslavement. That's why they have something which they call the industrial, right? The industrial, what they call that? Industrial prison complex. Right? Because they're about industry, commerce, money, and trade. And they're also about imprisoning people, which slavery, or I should say nowadays, prison is the new form of slavery. And they did that through the 13th Amendment. Right? So a confederacy is joined together or a lead. Right? A confederation, I'm reading from Wikipedia. A confederation is known as a confederacy or a league. A league. It is a political union. So our ancestors already had a political union before these black Europeans or these elite Moors came over here. Because they had a confederation. An article of confederation. And the first confederation or constitution was the great law of peace. Salam, right? Salam alaikum. They were practicing Islam way before these elite Moors came over here. It says the Confederation, also known as the Confederacy or the League, is a political union of sovereign states. So the states that were over here, right? So let's check it out. Right? Right? North America, right? What's the states in North America? Right? So you have North America, which is a continent. In northern and western hemisphere, North America is the border to the north by the Antarctic Ocean, to the east by the Atlantic Ocean, to the southeast by South America and the Caribbean, and to the south and west by the Pacific Ocean. The region includes Middle America, comprising the Caribbean, Southern America, and Mexico, and North America, right? Give me one minute, because I want to bring all this home. I'm looking for something. Give me 1 minute. Because this is all going to make sense, because they were sovereign states. We got 50 states. All those states were sovereign, right? And they had indigenous people on them, right? So the states over here that were sovereign states, that was put together by the indigenous Native Americans that were over here, who already had a government under the Article of Confederation, and they had a constitution called the Great Law of Peace, right? And this was a political union that they said that had sovereign states. The word sovereign means republic, right? And these states was what? Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, India, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, right? Minnesota, Mississippi, right? Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, right? Ohio, Oklahoma, etc. These were your sovereign states that were in a political union that was under a confederacy, which had a constitution which was known as the Great Law of Peace. And they had their own government, right? Each state was its own sovereign. So that means that each state had its own president. Back then, it wasn't one president for the whole United States. Each state was their own sovereign, so each state had their own president. And they came and they formed a political union under the Article of Confederation. And the first constitution was the Great Law of Peace that was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy, which were Native Americans. Right? Right? So it says Confederation, also known as the Confederacy or a league, is a political union of sovereign states. So each state had their own president back then, right? United for the purpose of common action, usually created by treaty. That's why you have these Indian treaties. So your different states, which had their own sovereign, right? Their own sovereignty, and they had their own presidents. That means there was 50 presidents, right? Back then they had the 13 colonies, right? Those 13 colonies were under the control and jurisdiction of the British Empire, but these were corporations that came in and infringed on the indigenous people. The indigenous people, they had 50 states. Each one individual sovereign had their own president, and they came together as a lead, a confederacy, and they created a political union of sovereign states united for the purpose of common action. And the first constitution was the Great Law of Peace that was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy. This was your first United States, which was based on protecting people alienable rights, which mean the alienable rights are rights that God give you. That's what that was about. That's what our people was about. Protecting the inalienable rights that God gave you, because they were spiritual people. They believed in God. So they didn't separate, they didn't exclude God from government and politics. They put all that together as a political union and as sovereign states for a common action. And they created treaties amongst each other, and they lived in peace. And they had a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. Right? So they created treaties. The Confederation of States tended to be established for dealing with critical issues such as defense, foreign relation, internal trade, or currency, with the central government being required to provide support for all its members. Confederalism represents a main form of intergovernmentalism, defined as any form of interaction around states that take place on the basis of sovereign independence or government. The key word is sovereign independent, meaning that each state that I read off to you had their own sovereignty, and they had their own president, and they came together as a political union for a common action as sovereign states, and they created treaties with each other, and they lived in peace and harmony with each other, right? And they did this under God, because this first United States was based on protecting alienable rights, which are rights that's given to you by God. Right? So this shows that they were spiritual people. So I'm going to come back one more, and we're going to finish building on the two Americas.